Welcome to our section on Pauline Chronology. In this first lecture, we will consider why we should care about the historical Paul, examine the types of evidence that we have, and talk about the appropriate methods for reconstructing Paul's biography. We begin by considering the broader question of why we should care about history at all. Here we can make at least 3 points. First, interpretation. A good understanding of the historical period from which our texts come can help serve as a check on our interpretations. For instance, many interpretations of Paul's letters suggest that they seek to combat a legalistic Judaism, i.e., a Judaism whose adherents sought to earn God's favor through their good works. As a study of Jewish sources from Paul's day will show, however, Jews by and large did not seek to obey the law because they thought that such obedience would somehow earn favor or obligate God. No, they sought to obey the law as a grateful response to God's prior gracious act of establishing his covenant with them. A knowledge of the historical period thus suggests that readers who see Paul combating a legalistic Judaism have misunderstood the apostle and need to revisit their interpretation of his letters. A second reason to care about history is application. Paul writes to specific congregations, and he addresses specific issues. Understanding what was going on in these churches is accordingly essential for a proper interpretation, as we just discussed. But understanding the issues specific to each church also aids in application. The better we understand these issues, the better we will be able to see parallels today in our own contexts. In other words, a good understanding of the historical context makes it easier to see how these biblical texts might relate to and address our modern churches today. Finally, incarnation. God took history seriously enough to enter into it in the person of Jesus and die an excruciating death on the cross. If God takes history that seriously, we probably should too. So history and historical context is important. But what about Pauline chronology in particular? Does it really matter when Paul went where? Well, yes it does. And we can again identify at least 3 points of significance. First is the possibility of Pauline development. Does Paul's theology develop from one letter to another? Many scholars suggest, for example, that Romans represents a rethinking and even a walking back of the positions that Paul staked out in Galatians. Well, the likelihood of such a development increases with the passage of time. If Galatians is Paul's first letter, or at least is written early in his ministry, and Romans represents the mature reflections of the apostle near the end of his ministry a decade or two later, then the possibility that Paul has grown in his understanding and perhaps changed his mind on some issues seems high. On the other hand, if Galatians and Romans are both written within the span of a few months near the end of Paul's ministry, and it seems highly unlikely that Paul's thought would have developed very much from one letter to the next. A second significance of Pauline chronology concerns the framing of Paul's theology. As Douglas Campbell observes, biographies of Paul have interpretive consequences. The potential time span between Galatians and Romans illustrates the importance of this second point as well. Interpreters often identify justification by faith as the core doctrine of Paul's theology, but this doctrine receives extensive treatment in only Romans and Galatians. If justification by faith is such a crucial doctrine in Paul's theological system, then why does he not reference it more often? Again, if Galatians and Romans represent opposite poles of Paul's ministry, then one could argue that, regardless of the somewhat odd lacuna in the middle, the issues surrounding justification by faith clearly spanned his entire ministry. On the other hand, if Galatians and Romans were written at the same time, then justification by faith might represent nothing more than Paul's ad hoc response to an issue that arose at a particular time. In that case, the doctrine might not deserve the emphasis it typically receives in the study of Pauline theology. We'll say much more about justification by faith once we get to Romans. Returning to Pauline chronology, however, how we reconstruct Paul's movements also has implications for our understanding of Acts. Does Acts seek to give us an accurate timeline of Paul's journeys and activities? Or, in the interest of making his theological points, does Luke shape his Pauline material in the same way that he seems to have shaped his Mark and Jesus material? To answer that question, we need to know how the timeline in Acts relates to Paul's actual chronology. This is a question that we will explore in this week's remaining lectures. How do we reconstruct Paul's chronology? To begin with, we basically have 2 sources: Paul's letters and Acts. We also have 2 types of data. Relative data establishes intervals between points in the chronology, as when Paul says in Galatians 1:18 that he went up to Jerusalem 3 years after Christ was revealed in him. This is the main type of data that we find in Paul's letters. Alternatively, absolute data relates Paul's movements to the larger historical timeline. Luke does this often in Acts, as, for example, in 11:28, when he announces that a prophesied famine occurred while Claudius was emperor. Now, Paul's letters are primary source material, meaning that they convey direct knowledge of Paul's chronology. John Knox accordingly argues that they must be given methodological priority in reconstructing Paul's movements. The problem is that the letters are occasional and disjointed in presenting chronological information. For the most part, Paul is not trying to lay out his biography in his letters, so they don't provide an overarching chronological framework. They instead provide us with fragmentary glimpses of biographical material as that material becomes relevant to his argument. Acts, on the other hand, does provide an overarching framework. With the possible exceptions of the we material that occurs towards the end, however, Acts is a secondary source, meaning that it is providing a second-hand account, an interpretation of Paul's chronology. This then raises the possibility that Acts has shaped the material to make its theological points. A methodological spectrum accordingly exists with regard to how we should relate Acts to the letters. On one end, we have scholars such as Ben Witherington, who suggest that we should preserve the historicity of Acts whenever possible. In the middle of our spectrum, we find scholars such as Robert Jewett, who accept the historicity of Acts whenever it is not contradicted by the letters and/or there is no evidence of editorial shaping. In other words, chronological information that happens to suit Luke's theological agenda must be regarded with suspicion, but otherwise we should assume his chronological information to be accurate, unless we have contradicting evidence. Finally, at the far end of the spectrum stand scholars such as John Knox and Gerhard Ludemann, who argue that we should accept the historicity of Acts only at points where it is actively confirmed by Paul's epistles. Knox accordingly suggests that when reconstructing Paul's biography, we should forget that we even have Acts, and start instead with what we would know about Paul if we had only his letters to go by. So what would we know? For starters, we would know that he was a Jewish Pharisee. Paul tells us as much in Romans 11:1, 2 Corinthians 11:22, Galatians 1:12-14, and Philippians 3:4-6. We would also know that at some point that Pharisaic trajectory was interrupted by a call from Christ. Whether Paul saw this call as a conversion to a new religion or a commissioning fulfillment of his preparation in Judaism is a question we will wrestle with over the next several weeks. As Pamela Eisenbaum notes, Acts seems to portray it more as a conversion. The Pauline accounts of this call in 1 Corinthians 15:8 and Galatians 1:15-16, however, read very differently from the Acts account. So that is how Knox proceeds. He begins with the letters. We will explore this method further by considering Paul's visits to Jerusalem. In the next lecture, we will reconstruct a timeline of Paul's Jerusalem visits from his epistles. In Lecture 3, we will then construct a similar timeline from the information in Acts. In the fourth and final lecture on Pauline chronology, we will then compare the two timelines.